I'm not saying that the gospel in itself calls for Christian nationalism. It's that a nation that orders itself properly will order the people to the gospel.
Join the best in the movement. It's conservative conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
I'm joined today by Stephen Wolfe. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for having me on.
And you're the author of The Case for Christian Nationalism. But before we talk about that, which is what we're going to discuss today in, I think, great detail, who are you? I think you wrote this book. You've kind of become a household name now amongst conservatives and conservative Christians, I think, in particular, and then also probably a lot of polemicists who really don't like you or your ideas and want to bash you for various reasons. But what's your background? What do you do on the day-to-day? How did you come to write a book like The Case for Christian Nationalism?
Stephen Wolfe. I wrote the book Case for Christian Nationalism. Here it is, I got in front of me, make sure I have a copy. And I live in North Carolina, kind of in the central Piedmont area. I grew up in California, moved away when I was to go to college in New York at West Point, and then graduated West Point, did 5 years active duty for the Army. And then after that, went to graduate school at LSU, did about 7-8 years there, I guess. Got a PhD in political theory, and then spent a year at Princeton at the James Madison Institute, and then moved to North Carolina about 2.5 years ago. And we kind of live out in the woods. You can kind of see it behind me a little bit there, and have a growing farm. Is pretty much so. I have various different jobs and things I'm a part of. I do some writing, do some teaching, and I do a lot of work on the property. So all sorts of things going on, and big plans and all that. So that's basically what I'm up to now.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show.
Gotcha. Thank you for your service. You talked a little bit about your military service and how you view the military and conservatives' relationship to the military and sort of its political significance in your book, which I think we'll get to. Before we really touch on Christian nationalism, I was very surprised in the approach of the book, emphasis a lot on natural law and principles of reason, which I don't really necessarily associate with Protestantism as this, very robust intellectual philosophy. Maybe that's a function of the, internalizing the contemporary prejudices against religious people and Christians as being sort of anti-reason. But was your approach very common amongst, Protestant intellectual works? Or is it sort of some harkening back to something old?
What you're describing. Yeah, so what you're describing is a 20th century phenomenon within the Protestant world. And really in no other century was it like that. So that there is this thing where a lot of Roman Catholics today think that they have this exclusive claim to the natural law and to reason and philosophy, and that's just completely not true. It's true within maybe the last several decades. There was I would say a major shift in the way Reformed people or Calvinists or classical Protestants, whatever, the way they viewed reason and philosophy and these other things, natural law, that really were not present in the past. And so my approach is, I would say is very much similar to what you would find in 16th century, 17th, maybe like 17th century works, that sort of thinking. And it was extremely common. And it's unfortunate. It's very frustrating to hear people say that I essentially have a Roman Catholic method or assumptions when that is just completely false. I think that, especially in the 17th century, every Protestant affirmed natural law. Most of them, I would say, were even Thomistic in a way. Now, what that means is controversial, I guess, but or it's kind of vague. But basically, they would fall when it comes to the debates between, say, Occam and Aquinas. The whole nominalist versus realist view. Uh, the In general, in the 17th century, they were more on the camp on the side of Thomas than they were Occam, and people don't realize that. In fact, in the most infamous, I guess you could say, nominalist was actually Roman Catholic. That is Rene Descartes, who was himself reacting, I would say, to polemics between kind of the battles between Protestants and Roman Catholics. And in fact, it was the Roman Catholic assumptions that drove, I think, him to radical skepticism, and not the Protestant. The Protestant perspective was you could read the Bible and through your own meditation upon it with the aid of the Holy Spirit, come to the truth. Whereas the Roman Catholic position was, no, actually, you can't do that. You need the magisterium. And so it was actually the Protestant side that was not the skeptical of reason side, because of their basic assumption that you could read the Bible yourself and come to the truth of it. So I think it's a really, really important question. And I'm actually, I deliberately wrote the book this way, not only because that's the way I think, and I mean, it's I don't think I could write a book differently than that, but also to kind of reintroduce this method to my Protestant audience. Most of the people reading the book are Protestants, usually Calvinist in some sense, and I wanted to kind of reintroduce this method, which is one that you could it assumes natural law, but it also just assumes that the functions of reason, the functions of logic. The basic syllogism is two premises, and if they are properly structured, two statements, and then you get a conclusion out of the syllogism. I wanted to approach the work that way, to kind of say, we can actually think this way, and we ought to. We shouldn't just rely upon the sort of vulgar proof texting that you often find in the evangelical world. So yeah, I think the method was very important, and I really hoped to, like I said, reintroduce that back into Protestantism.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm Catholic myself, so reading it was not unlike reading a lot of sort of Catholic political philosophy, and it's methodologically speaking, some maybe scriptural or belief differences in beliefs, or um, I know you don't like the word doctrines from the book, but different ways of viewing the faith and how that calls us to live in both political life, but also in our personal lives. But yeah, the method to me was very familiar. Without taking us too far afield, I'd be curious what happened where, from your accounting, the Protestants were being the more pro reason or not skeptical side, to where that flipped in the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, for the Roman Catholics had the benefit of, as I understand, like kind of a neo-Thomism in the late 19th
Yeah.
century, or 19th century. In the 20th century, and I think also, at least in America, there was, well, I should say that I think that I'll just get to the point. Like for Protestantism, it was a turn towards a more fundamentalist perspective, what we call fundamentalist, historically. And that was in reaction to Darwinianism and the rise of secularism. And there was, it cast like a deep suspicion over the society and what people were concluding. So the easiest way to flee the conclusions of evolution or Darwinianism, or the claims of the modern philosophy, was to simply say the whole thing was a failure from the get-go, because you were relying entirely on quote reason, or evidence, even evident, like external evidence, instead of just chapter verse, or exegesis from the Bible. And so that meant that those areas of knowledge and those areas of study were then kind of closed off from the Protestant world. This is a kind of a broader critique of fundamentalism in the Protestant world. And so this is why even today you don't find, like, if I mention the word sociology, people, like, a lot of people just they're like, oh, that's a secularist, that's a secular thing, which it is. Actually, sociology is in a sense new. I get that, but it's kind of a new sort of field. But nevertheless, for all the sort of branches of knowledge or disciplines study, there was kind of this retreat and just kind of hunker down with the Bible. That was one thing, but there also were there was it's weird because there were other than developments in theology. So you have the kind of the theonomist and the postmillennial um, kind of side. Sometimes it's referred to as biblicism. So you have that development, and then you have in philosophy, you have people like the neo-Calvinists, like Alvin Plantinga. There is a type of there is kind of a retreat from the natural theological arguments for the existence of God as well, and there's a move towards presuppositionalism, and this was all. Yeah, again, so it's a very complex sort of subject, but there was this shift away from all that in the Protestant world, but it just wasn't there in the 19th century all the way back to the reformers. None of these things were actually there. It was a 20th century reaction to developments in broader society, and I think we need to reclaim what we once had. I mean, even if you see after World War II, like after World War II, the Protestant mainline kind of lost confidence and fell and essentially liberalized, and we have what we have today. And the conservatives that rose up and became the post-war conservatives were largely Roman Catholic and Jews. There were some Protestants, but you have like William Buckley of of Roman Catholic. You have Russell Kirk. You have those guys, and so they kind of took over within the kind of intellectual conservative world, and Protestants, it's harder for them to enter into that space because they're constantly needing to justify whatever they say with a Bible verse, and so it doesn't always and often doesn't fit and it doesn't work. I've taught classes at these Christian universities even today, fairly recently, where you have these assignments on politics or whatever to think about this and that on politics, and always there has to be some kind of chapter and verse justification for whatever you conclude. So instead of just taking the wisdom of the of other readers, other writers you've read, or coming to some reasonable practical conclusion through just logic and considering the world, there has to be this kind of like biblicist approach to everything, instead of just examining the matter at hand. And I think Roman Catholics are better suited, um, given their perspectives today, to kind of lead an intellectual movement in politics as they have been for decades, precisely for that reason. Like they can distinguish philosophy and theology and sociology and these other disciplines, whereas the Protestants only very recently have been unable to kind of separate everything from a Bible study. And yeah, so part what I want to do is like when we do politics, let's say it's different than theology, different than ethics, different than these other things, and go from there. So
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think you have to be sympathetic to that move. Actually, is if reason becomes rationalistic and wants to exclude all their sources of knowledge, which I think like any scientist or modern sociologist would look at your book and be wouldn't know what to do with it, because you're taking sources that are biblical and theological and not natural and mixing them with natural principles that everyone and anyone could know regardless of religion. So when that happens, I think it makes sense that you would see a retreat from that, or making the war between science and religion. There probably is one, but that doesn't mean you need to throw out reason itself. You can go back to natural philosophy the way that the ancients were doing it. But all right, let's just get right into what is Christian nationalism. We did an episode with Mark David Hall, but you wrote a book advocating for it. Mark was critical in a sort of friendly way, but still nonetheless critical of it. So from your own perspective and your own definition, what is Christian nationalism?
yeah, so if I could start out with what it is not.
Go for it.
And this is because I would say 90% of the time, what I hear from people is actually not at all what I affirm, and even other people don't. Like people like Doug Wilson, they don't affirm, but it's not. So it's not bringing heaven down to earth. It's not pulling the New Jerusalem down through our own effort. It's not, to use a phrase you might be familiar with, it's not immanentizing the eschaton. It is not conflating or confounding earth and heaven. So fundamentally, I mean, I get the definition, but actually, it's an orientation. It's earthly life to heavenly life without confounding or conflating the two. It's not. It's not bringing. It's not making the kingdoms of this world the kingdom of God. It's not like let's make the United States the kingdom of God or whatever. So it's not that. Um, so that it's not forcing belief on people. But let's just get the definition. The definition that I have a complex one kind of in the book, but it's basically it's a people group or a people or a nation that identifies itself as Christian. They say we are Christian. We are a Christian people. They will then act in light of that, which means they enact civil laws and they have customs. They have a way of life, and that way of life is it's Christian because it orders the people there to eternal life. That is, it points them to primarily the instituted church, but also for just general spiritual life in the customs and the traditions. But also, people will care about their earthly life as well. So the more secular kind of temporal things as well. So yeah, again, it's a people it's a people group or nation that self-identifies, understands itself as a collective entity as Christian, and it acts in light of that. So it enacts laws and social customs. And the end is that they would acquire or seek their earthly and heavenly good. So again, what that means is it's not. What it means is that our earthly life is to be ordered to what's higher than earthly life, without kind of ripping it down. Just like a family, in the Protestant tradition, we do family worship as a family, or some sort of prayer together. When you do that, you're not eradicating the family, you're not eradicating the naturalness of it. It's not as if grace destroys that because you're still one man and one woman married with their children. So there still is that natural side to it, but that natural entity, that family, is now doing things that are oriented and pointed to higher things in their family worship or in their prayer together or in their attending church together, whatever it is. The same thing with the nation. A nation would say, "Hey, we're Christian. Let's act in light of that." And in doing so, they're not pulling heaven down to earth, but they are pointing to the things above. And so, practically, this would mean, I think, the basic thing would be like Sabbath laws, meaning Sunday there are to be laws that would restrict certain commerce unless it was emergency activity. Um, and also in terms of a social custom side, it would be the people would say we're Christian, and then they would essentially have a type of self-policing activity that you see. So we're very good at, for example, policing quote racism. With not racism, why not police against atheism, or why not police against blasphemy in some form? Why we're all very comfortable with, like, attacking and firing and whatever, the racists, but why not these other things as well that actually point to higher things? So that's the custom side of it. So in the end, it's not as if like it's some like the gospel. I'm not saying that the gospel itself that the gospel in itself calls for Christian nationalism. It's that a nation that orders itself properly will order the people to the gospel. So the people will say we ought to seek our good, which is basic political theory in a way. And what do we do when we seek our good? Well, we also need to seek the highest good, not just these lower temporal goods. And so seek the things that are above, and this would be through law and custom. All right. So yeah, there's all other things we can talk about, but that's a basic idea. It's really, I think people over theologize what my argument is, and they'll throw in these. You may not be familiar because it's not. I don't know if Roman Catholics talk about these, but the different eschatological views from postmillennialism, amillennialism, premillennialism. They throw in the eschatological views and try to decide between on that, but that's not at all at the way I approach it from the book. It's really just what is politics for? Politics is for seeking our good as a collective entity, as a group of people. So we arrange ourselves for our good. And my argument is that if it's going to be Christian, if you're going to have a Christian nation, then the nation itself should arrange itself for the Christian good, for Christian goods. And the most distinctive Christian good would be believing, placing your faith in Jesus Christ. And so a nation then recognizing what the highest good is should say, well, we can't force people to have faith in Christ. Um, we can't force them to believe something, just like we can't force people to get certain emotions and criminalize this or that. But we can, as a people, order that. In fact, so as a practical example, I was just talking to a guy last week, and he told me a story where he grew up as a Christian. I think he said he was in Long Island of all places. He was at Long Island, and he grew up as an evangelical Christian. And then he kind of fell away, I guess. And then when he was 20 or 21, he went to the local store to get some beer, to buy a bunch of booze, to go to the beach. Because it was a Sunday. It was on a Sunday. It was the morning time. He was going to buy some beer to spend the day at the beach. Okay. And he goes up to the counter. It's like 10 a.m. and he has a 6-pack or whatever it is. And the guy's like, I can't sell that to you because I can't sell beer until noon on Sunday. And he's like, oh, wow. And he told me, he said that moment when he was 20 years old, trying to buy beer at 10 a.m. on Sunday in Long Island, New York, he essentially said, I gotta straighten my life around again and start going back to church.
Wow.
And to this day, the guy is still in church. His family's in church. He's active in the local school and part of the classical Christian school. And so that's just one example of how, like, a Sabbath law. Well, yeah, I want to buy beer. I can't. Oh, yeah, right. I should. It's 10 o'clock. I should be worshiping God in Christ right now. So, that's just one example. And there's also there's just thousands of different little nudges that a society can create that affects different people. Like the beer may not affect you or me, but maybe the fact that I can't go to lunch or something on a Sunday, whatever it is, will kind of, remind us to attend church. So anyway.
Yeah, that makes
That's the idea of Christian nationalism. That's my very long explanation of what it is.
no, that makes sense, and it's like law and custom pointing to the highest good. But I think for a lot of people, many conservatives included, that idea that the civil power, while not compelling belief, as you said, would point us to the highest good, the heavenly good, as opposed to limiting itself to the highest potential earthly good, which is, the flourishing of the human person. So, not to necessarily even compel virtue, but to point us towards virtue, enabling us to act in a virtuous way and prohibiting us from acting viciously, especially when it hurts others. But maybe you could tie the knot or help us make the jump from the civil authority, from taking us from our highest earthly good to actually pointing us to the heavenly good, and then also combining that with Christianity to point us towards the heavenly kingdom.
Yeah, if I understand the question, I mean, there is the question of, okay, well, civil power is an outward thing, so it can't touch the conscience. It can't compel me to believe anything. Though I often reflect on the end of the book 1984, where there does seem to be a sort of outward compelled belief. I do reflect on, but that's unrelated. But sometimes I do think through that, well, that's interesting because it seemed to compel belief, but through just sheer act of terror. But yeah, there's the question of, so it's outward. Like you can say do this and do that, but you can't say believe this or don't believe that. Yeah, but the question is then, can outward things then conduce to inward good? That is, you can't force people to believe something, but can you create the conditions in which believing something is more likely or more reasonable, or it aids in that in some way? So, and I think everyone actually believes that for the most part, in a more general level, and so when you and I've heard that Roman Catholics they're not supposed to eat. Are you supposed to fast before you go to mass
an
on
hour
Sunday?
before. It used to be
Okay.
it used to be the whole morning. Now it's an hour before. Whenever you're going to church, you refrain from
Oh,
eating.
okay. So this doesn't apply to you though. Then, But for most Protestants, we, who are serious about Sunday morning worship, you will make sure you get enough, that you sleep well the night before. Many of us will then dress up. We'll dress in something appropriate. We'll have coffee and have a nice breakfast, and that's so that our bodies will neither hinder, but will not hinder, and it will also aid in our worship. So you don't want to be starving hungry because you want to reflect on the things of God, as you're in the service. And so the body does in some way, is a sort of support for the soul in that act of worship. And so in that way, outward things do actually matter for the setting the conditions for a kind of orderly inward state. And of course, we could worship heartily, being very hungry, but that is not an ideal, set of circumstances. So the same thing in the nation outwardly. If you set the conditions, one of my friends calls it coercive conditions conducive to conversion. So it's the four C's: coercive conditions, conducive to conversion. Um, and so you can say coercive is not really the point here, but you set these conditions that are conducive to belief in Christ, and worshiping, attending worship, and that sort of thing. So that's the idea. So it still only touches the outward, but we need to realize how much that outward actually is a support for the inward, and can act as a kind of that nudge occasionally to faith, even though it can't bring itself about, like itself cannot bring about faith. Just like if you're a parent, you can read the Bible to your kids, you can pray with your kids, you can do family worship with your kids, but you can't look at them straight in the face and say, "You will believe right now, believe, or I'll punish you." But you can do the best you can to create the outward conditions of a family home in which believing would be so natural to them that they wouldn't struggle with it. I mean, I grew up as a kind of a non-Christian, then became an atheist, and so for several years I was an atheist, and and partly because my mind was just had a certain like rationalistic bent towards it. I guess naturalistic. I don't know the exact word. And that still kind of lingers in me. And I wonder sometimes if I was raised in a strong Christian home, if I would have more of a kind of proclivity that would work against some of my rationalistic kind of tendencies that I have to deal with, and as a Christian. And I think, similarly, so like a nation would then form people so that in the foundations of the way they thinking, it would be easier for them to come to faith and then to exercise strong faith because they don't have the hindrances that come in a very um, uh, kind of a non-Christian environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, personally, I was raised in a Catholic home. And then, I mean, when you live in a culture you're going that is pretty antithetical to Christianity, which even going to a Catholic school, a lot of the principles and precepts that we were learning was like secularly rationalist mode of living, thinking, being, similar to I think what you were saying. So like that had a pretty big impact on me. But having that sort of antecedent Christian raising, like I knew the Bible, I knew what the old covenant and the new covenant said, even if I wasn't catechized very, very well until college, when I was started approaching it from a more philosophical, the Christian philosophical tradition, broadly speaking. But having that those early years made it, I think, easier or more familiar, so that I could accept it. Sort of what you were saying. So that makes sense. I'm curious. I think we'll get into some of Mark's critiques are about the religious side of Christian nationalism and how it could be problematic with respect towards Christianity. I'd be curious because there's another species of thinkers who are critical from a Christian perspective of the nationalist aspect of Christian nationalism. So I'd love to dive into that a bit more. What is nationalism, and why nationalism as I guess the level or the organizational structure of a political community?
Yeah, that's a I that's one of the critiques I take seriously. There's I've got so many critiques, and 90% of them are bad. But the conservative questioning of nationalism, I take seriously because even people within my own kind of world, within the paleo-conservative world, they don't like the word nationalism. They in America they associate with Yankee New Englanders, who are kind of going to dominate the South and all that. So I understand that critique. The way that, like I say in the introduction, I'm using this term, but I'm not trying to justify or appeal to any what political scientists or historians will kind of label. Like you have the set of cases of the nationalistic countries, and then people try to figure out what nationalism is. Even to this day, people who study nationalism can't actually figure out what it is because because they want it to be a certain thing, but there's no the cases on offer don't actually fit into some coherent thing. There's left wing and there's right wing, and so it's very difficult for even the best of students of nationalism. And so I didn't want to wade into that. I just wanted to say, all I know is that I'm describing this thing that I call a nation, and it's a people group in which they have similar customs and traditions, language, a similar place, similar history and sacrifices in the past. Um, but I want to say that that nation, when it identifies itself as an entity, as something. They say when we say we the people, and then say as a people we're going to do something for our good. That's what I basically mean by nationalism. It's a nation that then says we are a nation and we're gonna arrange ourselves for our good, and that's the sort of ism. You can call it nationism, I guess, but nationalism would be the program, would be the activity, it'd be the things that they do for their good. And so that's a more like broader definition than you're used to. I'd say it's basically like a classical conception of politics. You can see this within Aristotle in his book on politics, and like I mean, of course, he's focused on a city state. You can call it city statism, I guess. But whatever it is, it's people who are arranging themselves for their good. And he also says they have common pastimes and traditions, and there's these brotherhoods, and I'm just using the nation or nationalism in a broader sense, so it can encompass more than just the city, but a larger people group. So that's kind of like that's how I approached it. I knew that people. I mean, that's why I explicitly said up front that it's like, look, you can't critique my position by talking about how bad Nazi Germany was, or saying Mussolini's scary. Like that, none of that stuff's going to critique my position. And if you and really in the end, if people don't like, well, you're not using the word nationalism right. Okay, that's really not a critique of anything of substance. It's really just that I've used the wrong term. So which is fine. I really don't care if someone says that, because in the end, it's like, hey, fine, call whatever you want, but you're not critiquing the substance. But I do think nationalism fits because, again, it's a nation saying we're a nation and let's do good for ourselves.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think that definition or the way you've just described it, is completely unproblematic. And yet, nationalism is a very kind of problematic term, maybe for poor reasons. But um, I think this so far, I think, has covered like the first half of your book, which I'm then curious with some of these more foundational ideas thought through. You bring us to a chapter on the Christian Prince. I'd be curious to hear more about what the Christian Prince is and how the Christian Prince comes to embody and shore up the foundations of Christian nationalism.
Yeah. So as I was when I first proposed that book, as I was thinking through what to write, I think it was originally the Christian magistrate. That's the classical term that Protestants have used. I don't know if Catholics have, but that Protestants have used forever. But they also use the word Christian. They said prince or Christian prince. So it's not just Machiavelli, but people have used prince all the time, a long time, as kind of a stand-in for magistrate or ruler or whatever. And the person I was trying to describe as a great leader, a kind of great man, had to be more than just a generic ruler. And magistrates is kind of an older term no one kind of understands. It's also used in some Anglo tradition as for meaning something different than what I want to describe exactly. I wanted someone that was more than a policy wonk. He had to be a kind of man of the people who had a gravitas when he entered the room. So I thought Prince would fit that really well, and so I called it Christian Prince, which I'm very glad that I did for many reasons. And but the way I describe it is kind of going back to the great man tradition that for a people to be great, they need essentially great men to inspire and lead them. And it doesn't have and the way I do describe basically what he can do in principle. um, and one of the critiques that my friend Glenn Moots had of the book, which I think is a good critique, is that I didn't talk enough about constitutionalism. Like, it's one thing to say what something can do in principle. Like, I think civil power in the abstract can actually do like a lot, like a tremendous amount. But what do you do when you in constitutionalism? Well, you have that civil power and you channel it through some kind of arrangement that limits it, that directs it, that divides it in different branches. So that was a fair critique. But so when I'm describing, I'm talking to Christian Prince in relation to sort of abstract power that he has. But the main point is that he's a guy who will inspire the people to greatness. I think in our context would be someone who would re-energize America or any country in the West and seen their own potential, their past greatness and glory, and their potential presently for greatness and glory. And that requires figures. And so I think, if I ever get to do a revision someday of this book, I would probably include some reference to at some point, like George Washington as a quintessential American Christian prince. And I say that because he essentially, for I'd say he held this country he held the American people up in unity for 25 years or something like that, from when he was a general to when he was president, and even after he died. It was very common to find a little like a picture painting or of George Washington on the fireplace mantle. It was like this figure that reminded people he still held the nation together even after he died. And if you read like his farewell address, from presidential farewell address, I read that and he's basically saying, "Look, I held this stuff together. I'm tired. I'm retiring. I'm done. I'm going back home. And you guys have to make it work." And the farewell, it's a plea to the people. Say, hey, and near the end, he makes that famous line that sounds like what John Jay said in Federalist 2, which was, "Hey, you're one people, one tradition, one customs. You went through this struggle. You're not just 13 different colonies. You're not just 13 different states or countries. You're one people with these different states, but you're still one people. You are American. You should think," he has that line where he says, "You should think of yourself more as an American than whatever else you are locally." And he did that because he knew that he could have been the monarchy, he could have been the actual literal prince, but he chose not to do that. And anyway, he's just that kind of figure that, and people who like Abraham Lincoln could probably point to him as being one of those guys as well. I know that's not everyone likes Lincoln, but he was. I mean, he was, and to this day is still someone revered in certain circles as a kind of a key great man. So that there are examples, and I think George Washington is personally better than Lincoln in this regard. Um, but uh, but that's the idea. That's the idea of a Christian prince. It depends on, like, again, his power is not absolute. It depends on the arrangement of the people, but the power should come from a complete great man, which is a man of um, interpersonal genius, I guess you could say, or greatness of soul, or a sort of gravitas that he carries with him anywhere he goes. And in this way, like, Trump is not a Christian prince, but one reason why he is a sort of he has, I think, broken that barrier that held great men back. So Trump has all sorts of faults, but he came in, and you had these people who were kind of handpicked by the Republican Party, um, and led to horrible decisions like George W. Bush and others. And but kind of all these companies sort of in, and then Trump just shows up and with sheer personality just kind of broke that open. And so I see him as kind of paving the way for a man to rise and be to kind of instill greatness back in the country.
Yeah, that's fascinating. When I was reading the chapter on the Christian Prince, at the end, you were like, "Well, we don't really have any of these people today, but maybe we can have someone that's close to it or helps us usher in the next great prince." And this is a question that at ISI, I think we are very focused on: is regenerating or recreating, forming a generation of statesmen, not just wonkish people or bureaucrats who can like go in and staff the national security state or the managerial elite, whatever, but actually people who have this sort of, I think, gravitas, excellence of soul that you're describing, who can go in and lead people and lead the country towards greatness for another generation. I'd be curious how you think how you think, and specifically from the Christian perspective, we take Christianity as part of our inspiration, as a key part of our civilization. But from within your project, how this process of formation happens, particularly in an America today that is very hostile to Christianity. How do we create these next Christian princes?
Yeah, that is like the key question, isn't it? It's easy to do theory,
Yeah,
and then the practical side is, yeah. But things are happening within the conservative or the right wing world that no one, I think, would have predicted just several years ago. And there's new institutions that are opening up within some older institutions. You see more tolerance for right wing ideas. So for many years, from the 80s up until very very recently, there was a purging, almost like ritualistic purging of people on the right from different organizations and from power and from influence. And that's been happening, actually not 80s. I started before that, long before that. But there seems to be increasing tolerance for people who have ideas outside the sort of fusionist orthodoxy that we've seen in conservatism for a long time. And that's good. Like ISI, the last conference I went to with them, they included all sorts of people who I guess the kids call based, and that was a good sign to see that. And but yeah, things are changing, but it's going to require. It's very challenging. But I think one thing to remember is that it doesn't take a majority to change the whole. It does. You don't have to win a majority, and oftentimes winning the majority is a waste of time. You find a minority. I would just take the trans thing. I mean, 20 years ago, if we said that, yeah, you could get fired for saying trans is degenerate, people think you're crazy. But here we are, and that turned around from a very, very, very small segment of people, and it came to influence the medical associations, everything, because people were implanted and they had the different realms of power, and it became a sort of norm, despite everyone else thinking this is bizarre and weird. So it just took a few people to change things fairly radically. So that was for evil, but could also be for good. Um, and that's how most things change. That's how most things happen in the world. Is from the most devoted few are the ones who usually win out and end up shaping the whole. So this is multifaceted, from finding people, from putting people in power or in positions, and everything from bureaucracy to other institutions, and working from there. It's in order to have the Christian prince, you have to set conditions for it. You have to have people in DC. This is one problem with Trump in 2017 is that when he went to fill the various appointed roles, who knew these jobs, like who knew the bureaucracy well enough to run the bureaucracies. Well, it couldn't be these random people who helped in his campaign because bureaucracies are complex. They're difficult to manage. And so you need people with experience. And so since then, there's been people like, I think, American Moment and others, where they're now training people to fill those slots. And so I have a lot of hope. Um, and I'm just one small part in kind of a broader thing going on here. So yeah, I don't know. Is that what do you think? What do you think we should do?
Oh, good Lord. I have no idea. Which is why I ask people every week. I just, well, what do we do? That's always like the
Yeah,
final question.
yeah,
What are the prospects of
yeah.
saving civilization? Um,
Well, there's people like us who were kind of in. I mean, I don't know what you're up to, but like, there's people like us in the kind of the intellectual scene. We're writing the books, and we're talking to these high level stuff, and that's great. We need people like that. We also need people who are the person who can get in front of a camera and just be the bulldog for a position. And there are some people on my side who are like that. I'm very grateful for that. And then you need the guys who are just regular business owners and all that. And like, why do people ask me, like, I just own a power washing business, or I do this, and they're asking me, well, what can I do for this broader movement? And really, what I think it is that the churches need to see themselves as a kind of embattled
mhm.
minority within their own country. So maintain your heart for the country that you love. Realize that it's been essentially taken over by sort of occupying force, and see yourself as an embattled minority, even as a business owner. So what does this mean? Well, that means if you hire a guy, you're hiring some young guy from your church. If you're going to work with other businesses, work with other businesses that are Christian, right? If you need some sort of supplies or equipment, go to the Christian businesses and make it explicit that, hey, I'm doing this because we're fellow believers in a battle. So you create networks of security. One of the reasons why people have to be anonymous online, or they can't say what they want in public, is because they know they'll get fired. A friend of mine had a Uganda flag in his Twitter bio, and he got fired from his job because he had a Uganda flag, because the whole anti-gay bills and all that.
Wow.
And so so stuff like that. You create networks where you can help people out, and you have to see yourselves. This so hard for especially like um, white people in this country to see that, actually, you as Christians need to take yourselves as a occupied people, embattled, and act a lot like these ethnic minorities they come here and they start, um they'll form networks for their own kind of ethnic good, with everyone. Someone they're in your cousins in the DMV, so you get the driver's license, whatever it is. You have to see your own community group that you've formed of like-minded Christians as the place through which you get things done in the world, which is precisely what like foreigners do in this country. So, um, yeah, so that's something I think practically for the average person should do. But not everyone. Again, different people do different
Yeah, and
things.
first you have to recognize that there's actually a problem. And there are always problems, but
Yeah,
we're talking about a civilizational question problem when we're talking about something like Christian nationalism. And I think sort of the maybe voting with your dollar, voting with your feet, that's a very attractive solution to a problem, especially if you are taking the sort of nationalisms like, well, I'm a Christian, I'm going to focus on building up my community in opposition to this sort of occupying, I think you put it as the global American empire. Um, that is good. That's in one sense. In another sense, it would lead to a bifurcation of society, which we're already seeing, this sort of great sort. And so I think turning this into a question for you would be the prospects of America. Like, we're an extended republic. So instead of being something like a city state or a smaller ethnic group that lives within a geographical area, say Uganda. Not that I'm an expert in Ugandan politics and civilization, but just take the example. What do you think about Christian nationalism, like a pan-American Christian nationalism over the entire continental United States. The book has the cross over the entire, spreading its light over the entire country. Do you think it's possible to have Christian nationalism in the United States of America? Um, even practic, if the answer is practically no, like in principle, or is it something that Christian nations have to be much smaller and with much smaller groupings than something like 330 million?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't draw the cover. I like the cover, but it is one of those things where people get a kind of false impression of what the book is about. But yeah, do I think it's? I think, of course, think it is possible for America to be a Christian nationalist country or to be a Christian country, self consciously. Um, but the one of the like the point that what I'm trying to argue for is that this can happen at different levels. So this can happen at the county level, at the state level, and at the federal, the federal level. So it's not necessarily that it has to be that we do national politics and make the country Christian. If you are in a state like Idaho, or in the South, and or the kind of Midwest country states in which the majority people are Christian, then you should be able to do Christian things through power, through state power, either in the state or the county level. I realize there's constitutional questions involved, but that's where national politics comes into play as well. So you want national politics to leave room for more local and state level Christian action. So Christian political action. So yeah, I mean, the whole country. It's hard to see how states like Washington, Oregon, some the New England states, and then California are going to agree to kind of a Christian nation. But the what's nice about our system is it's got the federalist system, and so you have the states that should have very strong power, and even in matters of religion have strong power. So again, I would want to take out um, the incorporation doctrine with regard to the First Amendment in the states, so the states are free to regulate those things. To the satisfaction of the Christian population of those states, and so. But yeah, I hope for the whole country. But we should be realistic, and we should seek, I think, just local and state at this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe in the remaining
I mean, there could be there's not this like there is the debate over like do we wait for a revival or do we use state power? I mean, in a way, it's like both. So in order for our country to become Christian, there has to be kind of a massive revival in these states that don't have um, strong Christian population. Actually, in a lot of states, you don't need revival. You need like just straight up conversion from non-Christian positions or beliefs. But at the same time, there there are majority Christians. There are states with majority Christians. So why don't we act in light of that, like right now? And so there is that argument of yes, we need revival, but there's also that thing of well, we also need people to realize, hey, wait, you can act for your good in these ways. If we just convince a vocal minority that this could actually happen.
Yeah, I want to. Something we talked about with Mark in our episode on Christian nationalism towards the end was his laying out in his book some of his critiques of Christian nationalism from a Christian perspective. And I want to hear what your, I guess, response is. And one of those was kind of it was like a tolerance argument, basically, is that especially as diversity increases, not only like demographic diversity and more people of different religions coming in, but also sort of increasing secularization in the country, this state of majority Christianity in some places is on the decline or is waning. And so Mark's argument, hopefully I'm doing it justice here, is that we may not like this transformation of the country, but we have to be sensitive to it and sort of out of respect for differences of opinion, we should refrain from putting our hands too far on the scale in an explicitly dare I say, theocratic way, or trying to make the polity Christian, even if we're not forcing belief, or even if we're still allowing for protections for free exercise in some sort of prudential cases.
Yeah, I think that argument is something that for the majority of our history, the United States Americans wouldn't be very sensitive to, or there wouldn't be. I think Mark's view reflects a sensitivity towards non-Christian views that ultimately leads us to a type of neutrality stance in the public space. Um, the alternative to neutrality is not necessarily um, denying non-Christians of public services or public schooling or anything like that. The alternative is to say, yes, actually, this public school is going to be Christian, where we teach a basic. We're not gonna usurp the role of the churches, but we're going to teach a basic Christianity. We're going to teach from the Bible. You're going to learn English from the Bible or something like that. And if another student who's non-Christian or parent doesn't like that, then you can offer some alternative to that. I know there's in the past Roman Catholics didn't like public schooling because they thought it was too Protestant or whatever it was. Those things can be made available, but at the same time, saying that actually you're the exceptions. You're the exceptions. And what would have happened? We've actually flipped in this. It used to be somewhat like that, where there was, okay, you're Jehovah's Witness, and you don't want to do the pledge or something like that, so that you were the exception. Nowadays, Christians have become the exception because we think everything's a matter of religious liberty for us. And so I just saw online someone saying that, Biden's not going to allow essentially Christian families to adopt kids because they won't affirm the gender stuff, the trans stuff, and the gay stuff. And someone's response was, "Oh, this is a religious liberty issue. They should have religious liberty to do this," which means that you appeal the Constitution, and now the Christians are the exception to the rule. The rule says you have to affirm whatever gender this or that, and you have to affirm that you can't attack homosexuality and all that. But Christians, because of religious liberty, have the exception. And why? But I feel like in our mind, our minds have been structured that that's what we're that's the way things are supposed to be or will be no matter what, that things are going to be degenerate and bad. And so we just need to find some kind of protection to be an exception to the rule. And my point is, no, like, if we are the majority in this country or in this space, in this political space, in this county or in this state, we should be the rule. And actually, that other case, like, actually, the rule should be that if you adopt and you affirm that stuff, you're not allowed to adopt. But again, the mindset is that no, we need to be the exception. And I don't think that Mark would take it all like that far, but there is that sense that there's the fear that we're going to kind of offend non-Christians or something like that in this way. When this is just uh, it, it would actually be good for. I mean, think of all, like, as I'm not just because you're Roman Catholic, but like there's nominal Roman Catholics who don't attend church or maybe once or twice a year, and of course I know plenty of Protestants who are consider themselves evangelical or born again, but they never attend church or whatever it is. It seems to me that, like, loving your neighbor includes instructing those people in basic Christianity through the public school. And the fact that that a small percentage or a certain percentage will be offended by that is simply them being offended by other people being taught what is good and true and beautiful. And their opinion doesn't matter unless they're going to subvert and destroy the country over it. That's one thing. But if they're offended by the fact that the truth is being spoken through a public institution, then that's their problem, and we should not be sensitive to that. I think that we've just developed over the last few decades a sensitivity that just needs to go away. So that would be my response to Mark. I don't know if that addresses his argument directly.
I think it does. I'm trying to think of what the response that might be. I mean, one thing is, like, from my vantage point, Christianity kind of develops or creates the idea of religious liberty, because it's not only a works based, like you still like there are certain things that you have to do as Christians, or the sort of these Christian beliefs are going to inspire Christian nationalism, or sort of national action that's self-consciously Christian. But it is unlike, pagan nationalism, or like the ancient world, which is all just like you're doing your civic duties, and that's sort of your religious worship, or you're following the Mosaic law. Christianity, I think, at least, is the first that actually cares not only about orthopraxis but also of orthodoxy. It cares about your inward man. Like, I think that's a Christian creation. That's the difference that Christianity makes, so to speak. And so that also elevates man's, especially if we're going to say that the inward notions of conscience can't be forced or compelled or coerced. They have to be free, just as a matter of fact. That's what they are. That sort of creates a sort of understanding, or it can at least, religious liberty. I like that's sort of, and I even in your own book, I kind of see the move from like New England Protestantism that is quote unquote coercive or theocratic, um, towards more not libertarian but uh, capacious views for free exercise, not just privately but also publicly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think there is. Yeah, I do think that Christianity and Protestantism in particular, I'd argue, is it is kind of is the ground for religious liberty in the sort of modern West, or in the United States. I'd say our tradition of religious liberty, I'd say, actually kind of arose from Anglo-Protestant experience. But at the same time, I think that that taking a view of so I like if I'd say that our religious liberty in the 19th century was a type of pan-Christian or pan-Protestant conception, so that we can affirm each other's mutual faith, we can get along, and there's going to be some people who dissent and are heretical or different, but in general we can get along well in this environment, say that we're a Christian nation despite our differences. But that, I think, has been subverted and in a way inverted to make it so that now we have to tolerate anything and everything. So I think that the toleration of the 19th century has been subverted. And now it's been kind of inverted in the sense that now we are the ones asking for toleration. And it's a corruption. This is why I say that it's that when we're taking the exceptions, something's been corrupted in our own principles that we've developed. Like our principles of toleration and liberty have been kind of turned on their heads, such that now we are the exception requesters. But it should be the other way. Like, we should be the rule, and then we should be the one granting the exceptions. But I don't know. I don't know if we have the mental fortitude to do that. And in conservatism, it just seems too weak to put your foot down and say no. No, like we're gonna say we're the norm, and you're not. So um, yeah, I think another thing about like Mark's critique of Christian nationalism is it also he he's looking at it from a political scientist or sociologist kind of perspective, and I have differences with other people who claim the label on certain things, on like postmillennialism and these other theonomic views. And I think sometimes his critiques don't land on me because I don't actually affirm the positions he's critiquing. So which makes it difficult for him, because there are people who are kind of more in my camp, and people are on more the Doug Wilson camp, and we have our differences. Uh, so that's another thing to keep in mind. A lot of times when they're critiquing Doug Wilson, oftentimes they're actually not critiquing me. And then sometimes when they're critiquing me, they're not critiquing Doug Wilson. So it is difficult and challenging and probably frustrating, but that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to have Doug Wilson on and ask him what he thinks about what Christian nationalism is.
Yeah, he would. You invite him. Yeah.
Awesome. I have got
Yeah.
one more question that we haven't really touched on. Is we're talking about sort of inward versus outward action. The civil authority is primarily directed towards dealing with outward action in law, is their primary mechanism, and ordering that towards um, Christian ends and our highest end, and this sort of ideas of conscience and religious liberty. as being more inwardly directed, which suggests, and you talk about this in the book, as being a function of um, like ministers and pastors and that of the church. So there's a separation or distinction between church and state, though I think we're seeing throughout the episode how we're talking about how those things are related. Could we touch more on, and I think this might be one other potential avenue of critique that you could respond to, is when these things become too enmeshed together, not only does this create sort of spirit of hypocrisy where citizens are acting in a way, even if they don't believe it, but also how the state could potentially impose itself, or rather than the sort of religious liberty argument where we don't want the church too involved in politics, um, where we don't want the state too involved in religious matters or in matters of theology. What's in your view, the proper relationship on that side, the sort of the state imposing or interfering, so called, in theological matters, and how do we avoid some of these problems?
Yeah, so my view is that the state in principle, so apart from any kind of constitutional arrangement, just that power in the abstract can suppress blasphemy and heresy. Um, in principle, I think could compel people to attend church, and so that's where that's like in the abstract or in the possibilities. I see that as legitimate. Um, but all of those powers, like I said earlier, have to fit into a constitutional arrangement where the people decide that, hey, we can actually achieve our good by actually curtailing that power such that actually heretics are fine. Like you don't need I mean, for example, if like if someone who's like a babbling idiot and he says he's anti-Trinitarian in some sense on the side of the road, he just actually he harms that position more than he helps. So in a way, he might be a public nuisance, but he's not actually someone the state needs to suppress. So, and then in the American tradition, we've of course had wide religious liberty, and at the same time with religious instruction in schools and all that, with exceptions for people. And so I think but as a good American, I think we should retain kind of the pre-Warren Court views of religion. So that does mean you can suppress blasphemy. Certain like scandalous types of heresies could be suppressed as well. Sabbath observance can be mandated, but not church attendance. That is closing down kind of non-essential services on Sundays. I think that's like the most basic thing people can do. But yeah, I don't know. Does that kind of answer the question? I guess like why can the state do that? And it would be because the state has again power over outward affairs, but outward affairs can affect the good of someone's soul or what is in of the internal state. And so the state then can, in principle, act upon the things that can negatively affect the soul. And they can do that with knowledge of Christian truth. So it's not just natural, like purely natural truths, like God exists and that sort of thing, but actually that the natural truths informed by grace. So God is not just one; He's the triune God. That the means of salvation is not through works, but it's through faith in Jesus Christ. Like so, those would be truths that the magistrate can actually affirm and then enact in some way appropriately in law. But the best thing, I mean, the best condition would be that you don't need the laws, or that the laws just simply function as to maintain a positive culture that would suppress these things. Again, like I mentioned earlier, like we're okay with suppressing the racist, but why not the homosexual? Why not the trans? And then go further. Why not the atheist? Why not the like gross blasphemy or heresy? Why not also those things? If you're willing to do one, why not the others? And so it'd be best if society as a culture is what is enforcing those. As Burke would say, those are the sort of things the heart owns. It's not just a law and brute force. It's the idea that appears as socially ugly, from which people flee. I used a story recently on a podcast I did that our affections have been formed such that even the way we tolerate things is kind of goofy. So if you go to a bookstore downtown and outside that bookstore is like a rainbow flag, you might be thinking, like, let's just say it's a small rainbow flag. A lot of people, I'd say most Christians would be like, I don't really like that, but I'm going to go in there and check out what sort of used books they have. I just have to tolerate. This is the way the world is. And so they go in there and they tolerate. Some people would say, no, I'm not going to go in there. But I'd say most people would, even people who are very serious about their faith and who are very seriously against the whole LGBT stuff. But let's say there was a Confederate flag instead. Just a Confederate flag. That's it. It'd be a used bookstore Confederate flag, a small one, same size as before. I would say most Christians wouldn't walk in there. I would, because I'd be fascinated. Like, who's this guy with the used bookstore with the Confederate flag out front? Of course, I'd walk in. But I'd say most people would be like, oh, and they'd be offended. And like even Christians who like, they'd say something along the line, this guy's a racist or blah, blah, blah. So our affections, our responses to things have been shaped and formed. So like the racism is bad, the gay stuff is bad, but tolerable. And what I'm saying is that we as Christians in our country need to seek after the sort of social disgust that suppresses things that are actually bad. And that would suppress all those things. But I don't think people are willing to do it. They're willing to do it for what the world or what the regime essentially says is bad. So the racist is bad, but they're not willing to do it for the things that the regime says are good. Which goes to show you that even these evangelical elites that talk about like gospel culture and discipleship and all that's precisely what they would do. That their response would be is as I described. So. So we need to shape our social disgust.
Gotcha. Well, on that note,
now that's a whole other question how to do that.
Yeah, that's a big question in terms of like recreating a culture that can withstand the marks of imprimatur of the regime of here's what's approved, here's what's not approved. I think a lot of people don't even think we have that. But I would agree with you. I think we do. There are certain things that are very much. Every civilization has an Overton window. So how do we work within one that's hostile to ours? And I think ultimately your goal, and I think I share this goal as well, is overtaking the Overton window and saying, well, we need to have an Overton window that promotes the good, the true, and the beautiful. But yeah, Stephen, thanks for coming on and talking about your book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. We'll put it in the show notes so people can go read it if they haven't already. But what other things would you point readers to or our listeners to that they should read, listen to, follow your work, things like that?
So I'm starting to do a little bit more activity on my YouTube channel, which I think is just Stephen Wolfe, and you'll see a wolf there, cartoon wolf thing. But you can find some of my articles at AmericanReformer.com, I believe it's called American Reformer. So some of my writings have come out there. And that's about it. I guess you can follow me on Twitter. You'll see me kind of with my arms like this next to a river. That's me. So
awesome. Thanks again, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.